The creation accounts of the Bible were not original to the Bible. As we have already seen in a previous video, we talked about Enuma Elish, which was a Babylonian epic and formed the foundation for the creation accounts in Genesis. Today, I want to tear apart Genesis 1 and 2. Look at Enuma Elish and where the biblical writers actually borrowed some of the concepts and what that actually means. Welcome to Honest Ground. My name is Campbell. This is a channel where we explore the ancient origins of the biblical text. So glad you could join us today. Let's dive in. So, what we are talking about today is the creation sequence, and I want to start from here. Enuma Elish and the Genesis one in parallel. Okay? So, first of all, I have divided this into a stage and then Enuma Elish text, Genesis 1 text, and then the key similarities and differences. So let's talk about stage number 1, which is the pre-creation state. In Enuma Elish, Apsu, the freshwater god, and Tiamat, the saltwater god, mingle in primordial darkness. So what we mean basically is they have sex. Okay? There is no heaven, there is no earth. This is what is happening according to Enuma Elish. In Genesis chapter 1, we are told that the earth is formless and void. Tohu wabohu. Darkness is over the deep. Tehom. And then the wind or spirit of God moves over the waters. That is Genesis from the priestly or the peace source. The key differences or similarities here is that both begin with watery chaos and darkness. And the Hebrew Tehom is cognate with Tiamat. The crucial difference is that in Enuma Elish, these waters are gods. That is important to understand. The waters in Enuma Elish are deities. They are gods. Apsu for fresh water, Tiamat for salt water. In Genesis chapter number 1, they are inert under God's authority. Inert matter under God's authority. All right. So basically, they are nothing except what they are known as water. Okay. Now, when we look at divine action initiates. This is the stage we're looking at. What is happening in Enuma Elish? In Enuma Elish, gods are born from the mingling of Apsu and Tiamat. And then there is generational conflict that follows. Remember, the children, if you watch the previous video, the children that Apsu and Tiamat give birth to become a nuisance to Apsu and Tiamat, that they make a decision to kill those children / gods. And if you didn't follow the last video, something else ensues here, but generational conflict follows. In the Genesis account, God speaks. So there is fiat creation here. Let there be light. No divine birth, no conflict, no rival deities. Side note, however, there is an Egyptian epic or mythology when it comes to the speaking of creation into existence. Again, a story that is thousands of years older than the biblical narrative, where a god, I can't wait to share this with you at some point, but basically a god speaks the earth into existence. So again, here, though we're not comparing that epic to the biblical account, I just want to put that as a side note, that even the whole concept of God speaking the earth into being is not something that is original to the Hebrews. They heard it from somewhere, told over thousands of years, and they borrow that concept and bring it to the creation story. So back to Enuma Elish. what are some of the similarities, differences when it comes to divine action here in it being initiated? Okay, Genesis 1 eliminates theogony entirely. So there is no birth of any gods. There is no commingling whatsoever. God has no origin. He has no rivals. He has no family. Again, he just arrives. Elohim just arrives on the scene. This is from the Hebrew perspective. All right. The polytheistic frame is stripped away when it comes to Genesis chapter number 1, while retaining the cosmological vocabulary. Right? So the vocabulary of the waters is still maintained, the darkness over the deep, and et cetera, et cetera. Those kinds of terminologies from Enuma Elish are kept in the biblical narrative. However, when it comes to the polytheistic frame of multiple gods, that is stripped away and only one God. Okay? The next stage is the separation of the waters. In Enuma Elish again, we are told that Marduk slays Tiamat and splits her body. The upper half becomes the sky vault, and the lower half becomes the land or the earth. That's how, or that is rather the result of the separation of the waters. This is how it happens, rather. Okay, according to Enuma Elish. In the Genesis account, God creates the firmament, separating waters above from the waters below on day number 2. That is according to the biblical narrative. But again, when it comes to similarities, both involve firmament and separates the separation of cosmic waters. And in Enuma Elish, this is Tiamat's corpse. Okay, the corpse plays the role of the division. In Genesis 1, it is a divine act. Same cosmological structure, but just opposite theological meaning. Again, the writers of Genesis have an agenda when they take this whole creation concept from this 1,000-year epic and use it to communicate their own idea about how the world came to be. All right. The next stage is dry land that appears. How does that happen? In Enuma Elish again, the land is formed from Tiamat's lower body. The Euphrates and the Tigris actually come from her eyes, right? In Genesis, you will find these two rivers named in the biblical account. These rivers are also named in Enuma Elish. Again, we can see that the biblical writers are very aware of the epic of Enuma Elish, and they are borrowing from Enuma Elish, right? And they, in the Bible, tell us that there were two rivers that ran in the garden. One was the Tigris, one was the Euphrates. But in Enuma Elish, we're told that these rivers actually are the tears of Tiamat. Okay? So in Genesis account, God gathers the waters so that dry land appears. That is on day 3. God basically gathers the waters and dry land appears. Here are some of the similarities and differences. The functional parallel here is that both depict the emergence of habitable land from watery chaos. That is one thing that they have in common. But Genesis demythologizes by eliminating the corpse material altogether. Right? They remove mythology by not even mentioning the existence of a corpse or the corpse of Tiamat as the source of the dry land. Okay? The next stage is luminaries being created. If you remember from the story of Enuma Elish, Marduk assigns stations to the moon god Sin and the sun god Shamash, and they govern time. All right? In my video on Enuma Elish, I really did not go into detail about the names of these gods, etc., etc. I just told you that Marduk, in addition to separating the waters and creating land and sky, creates the luminaries, right? And assigns them to the gods. In the Genesis account, God creates greater light and lesser light. That is on day 4, sorry. So the moon and the sun are not actually even named, right? In Enuma Elish, they are gods. In the Genesis account, they're just the moon and stars, the moon and sun, right? Here again are the similarities. I don't know why my print is out of sync here. But key polemical tactic is that the Babylonian mythology recognized the sun, Shamash, and the moon, Sin, as major gods. The Genesis account deliberately avoids naming them, instead referring to them just as functional elements or instruments, rather. This appears to be a conscious effort to demythologize this part of the story again. All right. Next stage, living creatures. In Enuma Elish, Tiamat's monsters become constellations, mythology. General creation of living things is implied. So there's not a lot of detail about other forms of creation. It is implied in the epic itself. But Tiamat's monsters become constellations, right? In the Genesis account, God creates the sea, the creatures, the birds, the animals on day 5 and 6. That is a difference. And Genesis organizes a sequence of creation more intentionally. When you read Enuma Elish alongside Genesis, Genesis is organized. It's very, very systematic in terms of what happens. Later on, I'm going to compare Genesis chapter number 1, verse 26 to 28, and Genesis chapter number 2, verse 7, because those are two separate creation accounts, and they have similarities and differences. And some of this organization you're going to see, and even some things that are omitted from one story versus the other, you're also going to see. But the term sea monsters in Genesis chapter number 1, verse 21, sadly alludes to ancient Near Eastern chaos monsters while emphasizing that they are merely God's creatures. All right. Again, the Genesis writers look at Enuma Elish and go like, we're not going to call these name these sea monsters. We're going to allude to them, right? Chaos creatures are not explicitly named. They're just merely God's creatures. I hope that you're seeing how the biblical writers are using this Babylonian epic called Enuma Elish. And in fact, they use another epic that I will dive into in a later video because it really speaks into the flood story. All right. The next stage is human creation. The humans were created from the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's general, who was executed after the battle. And that blood was mixed with clay and with the purpose of creating humans to serve the gods. Again, human creation in Enuma Elish happens this way. Kingu is killed. His blood is mixed with clay. Out of that mixture comes humans that Marduk creates. All right. In Genesis, humans are created in the image of God. Selem Elohim. Purpose is to rule creation. And this happens on day number 6. So most theologically charged divergence in this whole study that we're doing here. This whole origin of humanity. In Enuma Elish, it is claimed that humans carry the blood of a defeated rebel deity to serve the gods in menial labor, while in Genesis chapter number 1, humans bear the image of their creator, and humans have dominion and not the gods. Okay? The next stage is divine rest, the whole concept of the Sabbath. Again, if you were raised in churchhood, you would think that, oh my gosh, this was such a divine invention. No way. In Enuma Elish, Marduk actually establishes Babylon, builds a Sagila temple, and the gods feast and rest. So the whole concept of the gods resting is not unique to biblical writers. In Genesis, we're told that on day number seven, which is a Sabbath, God rests. The cosmos itself becomes God's temple, right? Marduk builds a temple, the Asagila temple. For the God in Genesis, the cosmos that he creates becomes his temple, and he rests on the seventh day. Again, scholars like Walter and Levinson propose that Genesis chapter 1's 7-day structure mirrors ancient Near Eastern temple dedication rituals. In other words, there were already rituals in ancient Near Eastern religions that are mirrored by this whole Genesis Sabbath concept. And the depiction of God's rest after creation parallels divine rest in a finished temple, with the Sabbath as its culmination. So the 6 days, 5 days, God is creating the temple, so to speak, the cosmos. And on the seventh day, he rests. That is the creation sequence in Enuma Elish. Okay? Now, I want to talk about this whole transition that happens for humans from being servants to being image bearers. And I want to do a comparison of the Genesis creation accounts. So I'm going to look at 4 things. I'm going to name an element. I'm going to take a concept from Enuma Elish. And then I will take the P source concept in Genesis chapter number 1, verse 26 to 28. Compare it to Genesis chapter number 2, verse 7, which comes from the J source. If you're lost when I'm talking about the P source, the J source, go and watch the second video in this series where we talk about the documentary hypothesis model that is used to understand the Hebrew Bible. All right, concept number 1, or element number 1, I want to talk about the material that is used. In Enuma Elish, clay is mixed with blood of Kingu, the rebel executed after battle. Remember, we are now talking about the transition of humans from servants to image bearers. In Genesis chapter number 1, verse 26, there are no materials specified. Humans are created by divine fiat and word. Let us create man in our own image and in our likeness, and let them have dominion, right? There is no mention of material, right? So God created him, male and female, he created them, right? There is no mention of material. God speaks and the human is created. In Enuma Elish, blood of Kingu mixed with clay gives birth to a human. Genesis chapter number 2, verse 7 from the J source. The Bible says God forms the man from the dust of the ground, Adama. Yahweh breathes into his nostrils. Okay? Now, in fact, it's very, very interesting when you look at even the way that the Creator is addressed in Genesis chapter number 1. He's addressed as Elohim. In Genesis chapter number 2, he's addressed as Yahweh. Again, the J source, which is the Yahwist source, uses Yahweh. The P source, which is the priestly source, uses Elohim. Genesis 2, verse 7 tells us, again, kind of mirroring what is happening in Enuma Elish. There is actual hands of the God involved in the creation of a human, the dust of the ground. He forms the man from the dust of the ground. In Enuma Elish, Marduk mixes the blood of Kingu with clay, right? In Genesis 2, verse 7, Yahweh breathes into the nostrils of the human that he has created, and that human becomes a living being. Let us look at the next element, which is divine origin component. In Enuma Elish, the human bears the blood of the rebel deity Kingu. Okay? Human restlessness is explained by this heritage. In other words, because humans bear the blood or carry the blood of Kingu, who is a defeated rebel God. They are restless. Okay? So restlessness, according to human restlessness, according to Enuma Elish, is explained by the fact that humans came from Kingu. All right? In Genesis chapter number 1, verse 26, the human bears the Tselem, which is the image or likeness of God. No divine substance is transferred in this account of creation of the human. There is no transference of any divine blood, so to speak. In Genesis chapter number 2, verse 7, God's own breath, right, animates this clay figure. All right? In Enuma Elish, Marduk takes clay mixed with blood. That becomes a human, living being. In Genesis 2, verse 7, God forms the man from the dust of the ground, and then he breathes his own breath into that body, and that body becomes a living thing. It is an intimate, tactile act that Yahweh is involved in when it comes to creating the human in Genesis chapter number 2, verse 7. Okay? The next element I want to look at is the purpose that is stated. In Enuma Elish, we know this, explicitly stated to serve the gods was man created, to perform their labor, free them for leisure so that they could just sit on the beach and enjoy themselves. According to Enuma Elish, that's why the humans were created, to serve the gods. In Genesis chapter number 1, humans are given dominion over the creation. They're given the command to be fruitful and multiply. There is no servitude that is implied. Okay? Again, remember, it is people that are taking an epic mythological narrative such as Enuma Elish and using it in their own way to communicate what they believe and how their society is going to function. They're using a text that is thousands of years old and practiced by people, a religion practiced by people around them. And they're saying, for us, this is how we choose to think about the creation of humans. In Genesis chapter number 2, verse 7, the human is placed in the garden to till it and to keep it. But watch this. The human in Genesis 2, verse 7 is not a slave, but rather a steward. Again, the writers of the biblical text are trying to give reason for why humans should work, to be stewards, to take care of the garden that Yahweh has created. So Yahweh provides and not vice versa, right? They are making a case for why their religious system believes something other than what Enuma Elish says. The next element is the status of humans. In Enuma Elish, they're servants, substitutes for lower-ranking gods who rebelled against labor. And then in Genesis, their status is as Imago Dei, the image of God. They're given royal dominion language. They are given a unique status in creation. Again, the Hebrew writers are elevating humanity. They're elevating themselves. They're making people more important and not just servants of the gods. Please realize this. This is people reinterpreting an ancient text and creating a new way of living, worshiping, and being. Again, we are not here to give credence to the divine origin of these concepts, if any at all. What I am saying is that the evidence points to a group of people over hundreds of years borrowing from the religions around them and creating something that is new interpreting and creating, honestly, their own epic, their own mythology when it comes to the origin of the world and the origin of humanity. In Genesis chapter number 2, verse 7, we are told that this human that is created, the first human that is created, needs a companion. This human is an earthly creature, but animated by divine breath. We are told that this human that has been created is higher than animals, but made alongside them. Okay? Higher and better than animals, but still made alongside animals. The element of gender is another thing that we have to consider. In Enuma Elish, there is nothing specifically distinguished in terms of gender. In Genesis chapter number 1, we are told male and female, he created them. Now, this reflects their simultaneous and equal creation. In Genesis 1, the male and the female are created at the same time. And in Genesis 1, the male and the female are equal in creation. All right? So he creates them male and female. In Genesis chapter number 2, the male is created first. The female is then formed from the male's rib or his side. Okay? This indicates a sequential and distinct creation process, which contrasts or differs from the Genesis 1 account. Genesis 2, which is the Yahwist source, says Yahweh created humanity in sequence. The male came first, the female came second. The female was created from the male's rib, and there is a sequence to the creation. This difference right here points to, again, the differences in the sources of the material in the Hebrew Bible. The Yahwist source actually comes first. The priestly source is later. So I find that fascinating that when the editors are writing this, they're very aware of what is said in the priestly source in Genesis 1. Or rather, they're very aware in terms of what the Yahwist source says in Genesis 2, but they still decide to talk about the simultaneous creation of male and female. The two stories exist side by side, right? Again, we're not looking for harmonization here. We're just acknowledging the fact that these elements in the text exist. All right, relationship to death. Death is presented as something inherent, an aspect of the created order. When you come to Enuma Elish, mortality is built into it, okay? Genesis 1 mentions nothing about mortality. No death in the creation account. Genesis chapter number 2, verse 7, again, death is not present from the start. It is a concept or something that is introduced as a result of disobedience in Genesis chapter number 3. But I include it here because it is in the J source. Okay? Excuse me. Mortality is conditional, not inherent. All right? All right, let's talk about the last element, which is naming rights. In Enuma Elish, no naming narrative. No naming narrative. Okay? Man is not asked to name anything. In Genesis chapter number 1, humans are given dominion. Naming, again, is not narrated in Genesis chapter number 1. But in chapter number 2, Adam names all the animals, which signifies authority and a relationship. Okay? These are very important concepts for us to realize. In this series, what I'm trying to do is help us grapple with the reality that the Bible, the Hebrew Bible especially, is not as simple as people want to make it to be. It is a wonderful work of literary genius that I can't speak for whatever reason. I can't pronounce certain words today. But to me, it is fascinating that people sat down and created this piece of text. Now, you will have a problem with that statement if you're coming from the school of the scriptures were divinely inspired. One of the people that I actually credit for me being on this journey, Dr. Michael Heiser, because it's his book that I read first. The Unseen Realm. That kind of triggered in me this quest to really understand the world of the Bible. He said something that is fascinating. He says, a myth does not have to be true for it to be useful. I'm paraphrasing. But basically, a story doesn't have to be true for it to be useful. And a lot of people have problems processing the fact that some stories in the Bible are simply made up. But that doesn't make them less important. We can talk about the inspiration of Scripture, the schools of thought around inspiration of Scripture. But I've come to the conclusion, after much research and reflection, that some stories in the Bible are just that. They're stories, they're narratives, and that's okay. I'm sure you have gone to the movies and seen a movie that has moved you, and you walk away thinking, wow, I never thought about that, and changes your perspective on life. A story that was created by a writer somewhere in Hollywood actually may even change the trajectory of your life. It's a myth in terms of it's a story. It's not real, but it's useful. Again, if you go back and watch my video on mythology, you're going to understand that a mythology or a myth is not something that is false. It is rather a sacred story that is used by a group of people to explain their core beliefs and make sense of their world and the cosmic order. This is honest ground. And if you're interested in more of this kind of stuff, please hang around, because next time we're going to talk about another epic, another mythological saga that pulls us into the world of the flood as we know it in the Bible. But then again, spoiler alert, it's not original to the Hebrew Bible. See you next time.